Okay, I think we shall start to be punctual in respect to all of you, ladies and gentlemen, that joining us this morning. A very good morning, Frankfurt. A very good morning to our guests around the globe. Our 37th Food for Thought event in cooperation with the Association of Foreign Banks in Germany is starting today. In very short notice, as things have been turbulent the last couple of days. Ladies and gentlemen, this is our first Food for Thought in 22, and it's a highly urgent and very special edition. In view of the attack on the Ukraine, the European and the Western world reacted unequivocally and adopted far-reaching sanctions. Already the crisis has caused severe turbulences on the financial and the crude oil and gas markets. Russia is the world's largest gas exporter. Russia makes up roughly 40% of the gas burned in Europe and more than 50% of the gas burned in Germany. And we all know it's not only for heating, it's for industrial production, and it's particularly also for the production of fertilizer. So food is immediately impacted. Before the war happens, the conventional wisdom used to be that the complete shutdown of piped gas from Russia was unthinkable. But in the last couple of days, the unthinkable had to become thinkable. And during Russia's fiercest dispute over gas with Ukraine in 2009, only the gas flowing through that country was disrupted for a short period of time. However, today, are we still so confident about that judgment? If Russia does wield the gas weapon, how much would it hurt Europe? On the other hand, international energy giants like BP, Shell, Equinor said they would exit their joint ventures in Russia in gas and oil, which led to Moscow to decide to impose a temporary ban on foreign investors selling their Russian assets. How will the world energy market further develop? How would the US, the OPEC, and Russia, these three oil powers, deal with the crude price surge? How would we reassess each country's energy security post-crisis? Bearing these questions in mind, we are very honored to have Dr. Cornelia Meyer, Chairman and Chief Executive of MRL Corporation, Chairman and Chief Economist of the LBV Asset Management, Chairman of Schwero Holdings, a company listed in Australian Securities Exchange. Cornelia is a macro-economist and a very seasoned energy expert. She speaks fluently several languages, amongst them Russian. She has followed OPEC for a good 2 decades and covered every ministerial meeting on the organizations since 2006. She has a strong media presence as an energy and particularly energy security expert. She's a commentator and guest presenter on BBC, CNN, CNBC, Arabia, and Bloomberg. Cornelia was educated at St. Gallen University, the London School of Economics, and the Tokyo University. Dear audience, please feel free to input your questions during or after the speech in the Q&A section in Zoom. There will be no PowerPoint for the speech today, but the video is going to be recorded and posted on Frankfurt Main Finance website. Cornelia, I know you just came back from Saudi Arabia a few days ago. What's the news you're bringing? The stage is set, the stage is yours. Thank you, Cornelia.
Thank you, Hubertus, and it's a great, great honor to be with Food for Thought. It's my second time at Food for Thought. It's a great honor. And you said correctly, we have no slides. We both collectively erred on that side because the situation is so fluid and it's diplomatically so sensitive that we don't want to have slides taken out of context. So let us look at energy security, which once again has become topical. I remember I used to be on the Global Agenda Council for Energy Security of the World Economic Forum, which was disbanded in 2015 because everybody deemed energy transition to be more important I guess it's come back to bite us, and energy security is front and center again. Energy security is really a field that is between geopolitics, as we see now, energy transition, and technology, and obviously financeability. So what I will do today is give you first a quick definition of what we're talking about. And then we'll talk about energy transition, because we cannot disassociate this topic from energy transition, technology, and the thing that's really closest to my heart, which is the S, the social component of energy security, because that comes in here as well. Okay, the definition. It's affordable supply for all, internationally and nationally, of energy. But it is also security of demand, because if you are asking an investor to invest billions, if not trillions, into an ultra long cycle business, which energy generally is, it will take it. You need to have this security of supply, and that's the security of demand. Let us go first into the geopolitics, because the day that those tanks rolled across the Ukrainian border, Europe woke up to a new reality. But did she really wake up to a new reality? The security architecture has changed, but these changes were to be foreseen, I would argue. But let's see, how are we all affected? Hubertus went into that going in. But where does Russian oil flow to? 48% before this went to Europe, 31% to China. And over the last 10 years, China has become a really big off-taker of Russian oil, 9% to non-OECD Europe, and then obviously a lot also to Oceania. Only 1% went to the US, and in terms of US imports, Russian oil makes 3% of crude makes 1% of crude imports, and 3% of 3% of crude imports, and 1% of product imports. So you can see where the dependability is. In terms of gas, really, when you have oil, you have oil and it will find its market. You load it on a truck, you put it through a pipeline, you load it on a ship, you load it on a rail wagon, and it will find the market. Gas is more difficult. You actually first need the market and then find the gas, because the infrastructure involved in bringing gas to market is just so big. So for gas, 72% of Russian gas goes to OECD Europe, 72%, 17% to non-OECD Europe, and 11% to Oceania. So, and as Hubertus said, we in Europe receive 40% of gas through Russian pipeline networks, and Germany 55%. And we have to hold it to Russia that even when the country was literally breaking up, when the Soviet Union was breaking up, not a molecule was missing from burner tips in Europe. When we look at coal, 54% go to Asia, Oceania, and 31% to OECD Europe. And coal is also, it will become important as we get less gas, because we will need to somehow substitute for what we don't get in the electricity sector. Okay, we had a tight oil market even before then. We had OPEC plus the OPEC, the 13 OPEC countries, and the alliance with their 10 friends, which were led by Russia, had a hard time. They had to get down their supply by 9.7 million barrels a day in the aftermath of the pandemic, in the aftermath of that grim day when WTI turned negative for a day in April in 2020. And they have slowly but steadily, easy does it was the motto, added 400,000 barrels a day incrementally. And whereas in 2020 and even the beginning of 2021, the issue was how much will OPEC plus, how to make sure that the OPEC plus countries didn't overproduce, the thing looks different now. The market is incredibly tight. In January, according to S&P Platts, Platz, the only 160,000 of those incremental barrels actually hit the market. It was 400,000 were promised and 160,000 hit the market. And very, very few countries have spare capacity. Saudi has spare capacity, UAE has spare capacity, and obviously Iraq has some spare capacity. But you know, Africa has pretty much has its own security issues and other issues. And obviously there's the US, but shale has not come back as quickly as we thought it would come back. So we are undersupplied, and there we go. Now, what we've seen over the last few days, I've just checked the oil price. We are now with Brent at $118.4 per barrel and WTI at 114 barrels per dollar. So that dollars per barrel. So that's quite significant. When we look at this, despite of all of this, 70% of Russian crude had, after the invasion, had a hard time or cannot find a home. And looking at another country that had sanctions, which is Iran, what we see there is, what we saw there is that at a deep discount, the oil will finally find a home. And we saw that India was buying some and China was buying some when the discount got big enough here now. I wonder, it's very hard at this point to sell the oil, although it's not sanctioned. You have the problem of settlement because of certain banks being out of SWIFT. You have insurance costs and shipping costs crippled, tripled, quadrupled. I just wonder how it will be in a few months' time, because right now in Europe, we have a refinery maintenance season, which usually is, even if you have a tight oil market, you have an oversupply. Once we get out of that, European refiners will need crude. And, you know, crude is not crude. Especially older refineries cannot just substitute one crude for the other, because some of them are heavy and sour, others are light and sweet, and all of these things. So we will see what will happen when the refineries are thirsty for more oil again. That will be a very interesting thing to see. Especially older refineries have a hard time just switching from one quality of crude to the other. Then we have seen, as Hubertus said, BP has sold out of Russia. Shell is, and Exxon, they're all trying to exit. With BP, it's actually very significant. I used to work for BP many years ago, and I was actually an integral part of the TNK BP deal, of the Russia venture with BP, the joint venture, and on the integration of certain of these aspects. So looking at this, you know, the Russian side makes a big part of the crude, makes a big part of the profits. So it's quite hard. And for Shell too, you know, these were billions and billions of dollars that were invested. So there we go. What is Europe to do? And everybody, our politicians, I see Hubertus has a question. Hubertus, yes.
Let me come in at that point, Cornelia. It's fascinating to follow you, and as you said, you're really a deep insider in that market. You mentioned 70% of the Russian oil is seeking new homes, and discounts are given. How high are those discounts? What are we seeing in the market?
That's very. I've spoken to several of the trading companies, and they're very. It's a very murky business. Not a murky business, but it's not the most transparent. This is not the most transparent of businesses, but it's going to be a hefty discount. And you know, I always say oil trading or energy trading is where, you know, the demand, the consumer producer dialogue meets the dollar. Right, that is really where it meets the dollar. That's the best way of saying it. So we all pontificate about the consumer producer dialogue, and the one institution does a fantastic job at that, especially under its new Secretary General. That's the International Energy Forum. But really, where that meets the dollar is on the trading floors in Geneva, in Zug, in London, in Singapore.
Yeah, I was about to say, actually, the main trading floors are pretty nearby your home.
No, they're pretty. Well, it's not the. I mean, it's. You can when we look at it, 35% of oil gets traded through Switzerland, and 80% of Russian oil gets traded through Switzerland. But mind you, 50% of metals get traded through Switzerland, and 60% of metals, and 50% of sugar. So it's quite interesting. The Swissies are good traders.
There seem to be. So how do they respond? Do we see also traders pulling back from trading Russian oil?
Well, they will find, obviously they are, you look at Glencore, who's come out has come out saying we need to look at it. Obviously they're the ones who will pull back, and they're the ones who will not pull back. And frankly, I would not like to see them pull back, because they're the oil, they're the oil that greases the wheels. Forgive the pun. So I think it's actually important to have a valid role to play. And at this point, energy has not been sanctioned. At this point, they're free and clear. It's the reputational side that goes into this. But at this point, they're free and clear. It's not quite like it was with Iran. At this point, they're free and clear. So,
and Cornelia, let me also get to the substitution issue. You mentioned the refineries. You mentioned that they're geared towards a specific grade of sweetness or sourness of the oil, and the European refineries are at the moment, so to say, being under repair, being maintained.
It's called maintenance.
Maintenance, being maintenance. So thank you. And tell me, how flexible are these refineries? You said they're limitedly flexible, and what kind of where would the oil have to come from?
But you see, newer refineries have an easier time at substituting. Older refineries don't. Then also you have oil companies that have different philosophies. You always saw, for instance, that BP was trading around the various crudes and very flexible. Exxon, for instance, was geared towards operational excellence. I once had somebody from my former employer, GE, call me up and say, why can't I sell any of my refinery optimization instruments to Exxon, and why can't I sell it to BP? I said, because if you want to have a really efficient refinery, you will be less flexible. But so look, I'm not a refiner. I've never been in refining. I've always been in upstream. So they're by far better placed people to talk about that. I've always found refining quite an interesting thing, and I was always happy not to be in it, because it's very hard to make money in it.
But Cornelia, would you know where would oil have to come from as an alternative to Russian oil? What other source would be similar in terms?
And that's globally. What are the alternatives? I mean, as I said, OPEC Plus is very tight. The US can produce, the shale barrels can come on. The shale industry is very restructured. The big boys have moved in. There's fewer mom and pop shops in that scenario. You have Iran that could bring about 1.3 million barrels of exports onto the market if the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal negotiations, went well. They have quite a bit in storage that they could release now, and then over time they could ramp up their production. Some people are skeptical on how fast. Last time around, it was very, very interesting how fast they could do that. But mind you, the JCPOA is negotiated by the P5, the Permanent Five of the Security Council, and Germany. And guess what? Russia is one of the permanent five. So there is that thing as well. But it's really hard. I mean, there's just not enough spare capacity, and there's a lot of thirst for oil. So can we move on?
Let's continue. Let's continue. Yes.
So especially with gas, which is very important for the heating of European homes, it's, as Hubertus pointed out, important for fertilizers and so on. Obviously, LNG is if we can't get the gas from across the pipelines from Russia, which so far we're still getting it. So far, it's also not sanctioned. The issue is a lot of people say, oh, we will just get LNG from other places. What we have to see is LNG is on long-term supply contracts, and the current production, number one is Australia, number two is Qatar, number three is US, and number four is Russia, number five Malaysia. The US is set to overtake everybody by this year. They really had lots of investment in LNG. That's nice, but you know, these molecules are promised, and China has become the largest importer of LNG, followed by Japan and by Korea. Now we can obviously say, oh, you know, these long-term supply contracts, if the price is right, people will break it. There's a lot of people who say that. I hope not, because I happen to believe, a strong believer in the sanctity of contracts. But looking at it, even if we wanted, even if the gas was available, we don't have the regasification terminals, and they take time to build, and then it takes time to build the infrastructure to feed that regasified gas into the pipelines. Now, there are about 120 million tons of LNG production that are sort of sanctioned but need more permission to be fast-tracked in the US. But even if that comes on stream, I spoke to one of the biggest brains and the architects of US LNG, who told me, look, even if it comes, even if we really fast track it, it will only be available in 5 years' time. So the question remains, what will Europe do? And that brings us then actually to the energy transition, because you know, how will Europe and how will the world, if we are short of gas, if we're short of oil, how will we deal with energy transition? Hubertus, do you have any other interventions or questions to this part, or can I move on to energy transition?
Please move on.
Okay, thank you. You see, I always listen to what you say. I'm very obedient. So energy transition, and we have this very high stretch goal of reaching net zero by 2050. And let us be clear here. We all want to save the planet, and we all want our children and our grandchildren to be able to be in an inhabitable planet. And if climate change gets out of whack, the security dimensions, the migration dimensions are very big. But let's look at it from a financing point of view, the macro point of view. We need trillions of dollars to every year, 3-4 trillion, to finance energy security. And I've always find S&P 500 is a good litmus test. You know, there are other sources of funds in Saudi and everywhere else, but S&P 500 is a good litmus test. In 1990, 19.3% of funds invested in energy in the S&P 500 were in energy and utilities. In February 2020, it was 6%. The volatility in 1990 was 18.2%. The volatility in February 2022 was 58.1%. And obviously volatility is volatile, it goes up and down, but it shows you a direction. So in other words, it's less money goes there and it's more volatile. That's not good for long term. That's a difficult value proposition for an ultra long-term sector and an ultra long-term investor. We can also see that because we have created new realities with energy transition. The net zero report for net zero by 2050 report by the IEA has really created has brought a shift of behavior about. I mean, we were all going towards ESG, but when that report came out, right afterwards, 14 of the biggest asset managers in the world wrote to 68 of the largest banks in the world and said, you either adhere to the IEA vision or you will no longer get our business. And that was a coming to Jesus moment for the banks. And we've seen a financing shift, especially what I would call the nice money, the good debt money from the nice banks. It's harder to come by for the fossil fuel industry. It was between 2015 and 2020, it was $4 trillion that was invested. But when you look at it, if you look at how much was invested in fossil fuels, how much in renewables, these lines were intersecting last year. So it's exponentially more to clean energy and exponentially less to fossil fuels. And therein, again, we all want to save the world, but with the road to net zero, we have to be, we have to be careful of how we get from A to B, which brings me to technology. If I look at it in 2020, the IEA put out a report on technologies, and they said that the carbon reduction technologies, 50% of them were needed to get to net zero by 2050, were not yet commercial as of yet. So that's or not yet found. So that's a real bit. So in other words, what I would urge people to be, and I know that many people is agnostic about technologies. There is no one silver bullet. It's not just renewables or wind or solar, because they will never be good base loaders in electricity. So we need to be open. We need to look at hydrogen, which people are starting to look at, green or blue hydrogen. And we need to look at CCUS, carbon capture and utilization and storage. And so we need, we need to look, I mean, there are other things we need to look at, and the European Commission came to that remember when we all were celebrating New Year's Eve, the European Commission issued a new guideline telling us that yes, under certain circumstances, gas and nuclear were to be considered as cleaner energies as well. So even the European Commission with its Green Deal, with its green strategy, is getting there. I personally find a framework very good, and that's the one of Saudi Arabia, which is the circular carbon economy, because it looks at reducing, reusing, recycling, and removing carbon. And I think that's sort of an open way of looking at it, and one should really look at it. So that is that much to technology and energy security. And where I have a little bit of a problem is that we need to be very clear. The politicians need to be a little bit more honest with the populations in terms of what the costs will be. Because everybody now is very happy about energy transition. I'm very happy about energy transition, but we need to be conscious of the costs, which brings me to my last point, which, clearly, before I go to my last point, we have to be clear that net zero does not equal zero carbons, because we need to look at carbon reduction technologies as well. Anyhow, let me go to the last part, which is the social aspect of ESG. And if you ask me what keeps me up at night, obviously this horrendous picture of the Ukraine keeps me up at night, but the horrendous picture in Syria also kept me up at night, and in other parts of the world. But what really worries me is that we are so over-focused in ESG on the E part that we're forgetting about the S part. And that has ramifications in OECD countries and with how the North-South dialogue pans out. In OECD countries, certain segments of the population may find it hard to cope with energy transition and the costs of it. I always give this example of a worker who saved his whole life to own his house, and now he has a house which is on maybe an oil heating or gas heating, and he's told you need to go to other technologies, and that will cost him 100K or 50K, but he's 75, he lives on a minimum pension. No bank will give him a mortgage, and so what is he to do? What is he to do? You know, he can't afford this, and the danger is that we will disenfranchise the poorer segments of population, and that they will feel left behind by the elite, and that is not good for social stability. So politicians who have a 4-year time horizon need to think in long term of how we get from A to B. These transitions are hard and they take time. And the second one, and the last point, which is probably the point that keeps me up at night the most, is the developing world. When you look at it, for us in OECD countries, we have the money, or even GCC countries, we have the money to put in the networks for e-mobility, you know, the loading stations and so on. We may need to come from other places, but essentially we can afford it. If you are a developing country, you may not have that money, you know, because you still need schools, you need hospitals, you need feed people, you may have a problem of not enough food. And so for them, the question is, how will they cope with energy transition? And they will need the help, and they will need the help of the development finance institutions who are thinking very, very substantially about that in that context. But some of these countries feel left behind already now by this energy transition and by what's financeable and what's not financeable. In that sense, the COP in Cairo will be very interesting to see how the African countries respond, because we should not forget that we have now 800 million people living in energy poverty, and that's not fun. I mean, you know, that's really, I used to be a development banker. That's very, very bad. But we will have 2 billion people more by 2050. And these 2 billion people are not going to be born in America and in Europe. These 2 billion people are going to be born in Africa, in the poorer countries of Asia. So if we are not careful, we could see a scenario where 20% of the world population lives in energy poverty. Again, that's where the development finance institutions come in, and all of us. But we really need to think very strategically about this. We need to be agnostic about technology, and just try to make sure that we don't have people falling through the cracks. So on that happy note, it's again energy security. It's about geopolitics, as it is very front and center now, but it's also about the energy transition. It's also about technology, and it's also about the financeability of getting from A to B. And again, we all want to save the planet, but let's not forget the S in the ESG. So here we are.
Excellent, Cornelia. What a ride! so many absolutely crucial topics in such short of time. Thank you very much. Let's probably start with your first point: the energy security and geopolitics. So, what do you sense? Would countries have different perspectives? How would they assess their energy security? Do you have already a feeling about it? I know you've been advising the World Economic Forum until the very day they had energy security on their topic. So what do you sense when it's going to be started now? Is it also a north-south divide here, or what are we going to see?
It's a divide of ideology. because the West, and I would include Japan in the West, the OECD West, right, said, oh, if we have markets, it will all work out. You know, remember in the 90s, we all believed in the markets and we all wanted to look at shareholders. And then by the 2010s, we decided that, oh, well, maybe stakeholders are important too, and we should think of them as well. And you saw, if we have the markets, you know, Adam Smith's invisible hand will solve it all. Whereas countries like China looked at it and said, if I own the molecule, I feel secure. If I don't own the molecule, I will not feel secure. And you saw that by, you know, by how CNOOC, CMPC, how they really very aggressively went after upstream properties in Africa, in Central Asia, how they built those in no time. I was amazed, you know, how quickly the gas pipelines from Central Asia to China were built. I always said, oh, they'll never get there so fast. And then I just looked, it was like Pudong, you know, when you looked at Shanghai, there was nothing. And then next time you went to Shanghai, a few years later, there was Pudong. And then next time you went, Pudong was even bigger. So I was really amazed. But there's a different approach, and I think some of these China and also India have probably a little bit more sanguine approach. But the Western countries will come back to the molecules. It was interesting under Trump, under former President Donald Trump. The US also shifted. I saw a shift. You know, we want to be the biggest oil producer. They are the biggest oil producer again. We need to have everything onshore here. Energy security as defined, that we produce it within our own borders, which if you're the US, you have the luxury to think like that. If you're Europe, you don't. And if you're Japan, you clearly don't.
So Cornelia, will we have a move back also into exploration again? I mean, the most battered sector of the industry probably has been exploration. So will we see money flow back into it again?
I hope we will, but it is really difficult. And I never wanted, and we had this, Hubertus, you and I had this discussion, I think, in summer at some stage, where you made a very, very pertinent point where I said, oh God, we were not going to get any money. And you said, you will get money, you will just not get what I call the nice money, you know, it will be private equity and it will just be more expensive money. And yes, we will find everything with money, everything is a question of price, right? And we will see money flow back, but we need to probably make it easier for money to flow back, but not at the expense, don't get me wrong, not at the expense of investing in solar, in wind, and in all of those sources of energy, because we need to save the planet. We just need to make sure that while we save the planet, we leave nobody behind.
So we have a very interesting question going in that direction, Cornelia. So what would actually your advice be to investors now, looking at these various factors? Let's probably start with, rather than have it more general, have it nailed down to investors in energy. What should they do?
Well, it's a really, my advice would be less to investors. My advice would be to regulators to come up with frameworks that they can depend on, because at this point, you know, these regulatory, especially in OECD countries, these regulatory edicts, they keep on changing, and what was good today is not good tomorrow. And as I said, we need security of demand if you want to invest, because especially oil and gas, that's an ultra long cycle business, right? If you invest in that, you know, if I invest $1 today, the first barrel I am producing is between 3 and 10 years, depending on what I invest in. And, you know, the first barrel is not getting my investment back. That's then another 10 years. So it's an ultra long cycle business. So I need to rely on it. And, you know, I've been burned personally. When I worked for BP, we were looking at carbon capture and storage. At that time, it was only CCS. Now it's CCUS. And we were looking at it for a platform, and we had really good tax breaks for it. And we invested, I think, $1 billion or something, and then the government changed and took the subsidies away. So if you have that uncertainty, it's very hard to invest. So yes, I think money will flow back, but it will help money to flow back if you get a good regulatory framework. And I guess the banks also, we need to sort of look at how we frame ESG, and asset managers need to look at that, because the banks are not framing it. It's the asset managers who are framing it for them. If the biggest hedge fund in the world does not use me anymore, I'm not going to do it. It's the same with, we saw in the sanctions, regime. I would make a parallel to the sanctions with Iran. The US, in very good, well-meaning way, came up with an alternative payment channel, but the bank said, no, we're not going to do that, because if that locks us out from the largest financial market in the world, forget it. So we really need to go a little bit back to the drawing board and see how do we will need oil and gas for the next 30 years. So how are we going to invest? How are we going to divide up the investment? And how are we going to come up with regulatory frameworks and governance frameworks that work? And again, this is an energy transition. Is not something you do from today to tomorrow. This is something that usually takes more than 2 decades. We want to do this in less than 2 decades. And that's just not possible.
Yeah, let's revisit energy transition in Europe. Gas obviously played a key role. You mentioned that as an interim solution, as a transition technology. So will you see that revisited? Will that change from your point of view now?
No, I think right now probably people say, "Oh, we will not." Now we will have well-meaning politicians say, "We always told you we needed to move forward with energy transition, and we need to do all wind and all solar." But that's just not going to plug the hole, and it's especially not going to plug the hole for the socially weaker, because it's going to become unaffordable for them. And we can in England, we have as you know, I'm both British and Swiss. We have people who have decide between heating and eating. That is not acceptable. That is absolutely not acceptable. So I think we will need to look at it. The European Commission came back and said, yes, gas and nuclear we should look at again. But we will need to see, and there will be, LNG will have a part to play. But again, if I get to US, it was so nice when I'm told that there's 120 million tons and they could come our way in 5 years' time. We need it now, and we need the regasification terminals now. We need the infrastructure linking the terminals into the pipeline system now. And the thing there is, it's again, these things don't happen overnight, and we are with gas. We are. It's you find the market, then you find the gas. With oil, I find the oil. I will find the, even if it's sanctioned, I will find a home for that oil.
Mm-hmm. Let's stick a little bit more with the transformation issue. You mentioned the circular carbon economy. Yeah. Can you elaborate a little bit what's to be learned for Europe and the rest of the world about it?
I think that I actually think that His Royal Highness Prince Abdulaziz bin Salman, who is the energy minister of Saudi Arabia, is really onto something. He looked at the circular economy, right? And he said, okay, we can do a circular carbon economy. And he said, we need to reduce. So we need to reduce the carbon footprint, right? We need to reuse, the carbon. We can inject it. We can do things. We can turn it into something that becomes building materials or whatever. And obviously we need to remove. So that's a very good, that's a very important part of and we need to recycle some of the carbon that we have. We can recycle. So that's a very good, that's an agnostic way. And let's look at all the technologies we have to do that. And that's what I find so pertinent, and what I just wished we in the West had a bit more of. It is really agnostic. We need to become agnostic on technologies and look at them on their merit. And that's one thing that to me is very important that we don't do. And I was shot down in the World Economic Forum when I proposed that, and I hope at some stage somebody will pick it up and I can work with somebody on that. Is what we want to do is we want to look at a full life cycle from inception, right, from the drawing board through decommissioning. And we want to see the carbon footprint and the investment, because only if we understand for uses and for sources of energy, only if we understand that lifespan of carbon emissions and money that it costs, can we give our policymakers, they also need tools to look at what they want, where they want to put the regulations, and the investor need tools. That is really something we need to look at. And I've been advocating that for a long time. I know it's incredibly hard, but we should really start looking at it.
Yeah. Excellent, Cornelia. And let's go to the last point, the S in the ESG. You mentioned a striking number that 800 million people live in energy poverty, and we will have 2 billion additional inhabitants on our planet until 2050. So what's to do with, for example, working with Africa? Obviously, quite many of them will be on the African continent. So what would be basically your take on how to work on energy supply, infrastructure, and renewable energy in Africa?
Yeah, again, we need to be agnostic, right? We need to look at obviously renewable energy, and especially off-grid solutions. You don't have a grid everywhere. And as you know, I used to live in the Philippines. If you look at Philippines, if you look at Indonesia, if you have these islands, off-grid solutions are a really good idea. And that's where solar comes in places where you have a lot of sun. But so obviously we need to look at renewables. We also need to look at hydrocarbons. I think I can sense, I've been speaking to a lot of the of sort of people in developing countries, that they are, especially hydrocarbon producing developing countries, that they say, well, we feel a little bit left behind with the whole road to net zero. And yes, we want to save the environment, but we also need to feed our people. We also need to provide energy for our people. And especially in places, let's say if I look at Nigeria, if I look at some of these places, you will have more middle classes. They want to be mobile, so you need to, and you may not have the money in a huge country like that to immediately invest in fueling stations. So that's really where the governments, and I think that's where the development finance institutions have a huge role to play. And where, being agnostic and talking, the one thing that worries me about it is just the pitch of the conversation when we talk about energy transition. The interaction, the people who really want to have energy transition now, and the people say, well, hey, you still need fossil fuels. They're not really listening to each other. That dialogue needs to happen, and that respectful listening. If somebody tells me, I'm somebody who believes we need both, right? But I need to listen to the person who says we need to do it all with renewables, and it would be very welcome if they also listen to the other ones. We need to take the pitch, we need to take the sting out of that debate, and we need to learn again to listen generously to one another.
Yeah, as we all know, you're very media savvy. The next question is going to be interesting. What role do media play in that discussion?
Well, the media play a very big role, and you look at the CNN. They are all over. They're all over the energy transition, and the good media will play a role in. And as you know, I do quite a bit of media. The good media will listen. They play a role in giving the floor to both sides. I just wished that the pitch was lower in some of the, it's too aggressive. I was at a meeting not so long ago where I just was quite shocked by how strident, I'm not saying from which side, somebody was from one side of that debate. We just all need to become a lot less strident. We need to listen a lot more. Funny from a person who talks as much as me to say we need to listen a lot.
But you do. You're an excellent listener, Cornelia. I can attest to that. The next, and so far from our audience, last question is a little bit off topic, but of course very pressure. It's about inflation. We have seen inflation go well beyond 5%, unthinkable a few months ago. We had even the debate in Europe, it was that it was a transitory sort of inflation. My take was the most transitory about the transitory of inflation was the word transitory.
Exactly. No, I'm absolutely in your ballpark, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was missing in my speech. But inflation is really important, because with energy prices where we see them now, inflation is important, and you will see the US probably above 10%. You will see Germany above 6%. You will even see inflation in places like Switzerland and Japan. So everybody will be stung by that. That will have ramifications for interest rates. How I described this, I had a very interesting conversation with somebody because preparing for this talk, and I said, to me, it looks like a bullet train going at fullest speed towards recession, and we see the recession there, and we can't stop the train. That's what I see. The other thing is very depressing. The other thing I would like people to think about is the oil price. I mean, we probably are going to see it again at 150 at some stage, or we might well. But it's different. Remember in 2008, the oil price went to 150, but it was qualitatively very different, because at that time we had a very low dollar. So a lot of money in oil was actually not about oil. It was about, there's loads of spare capacity then. It was about oil is my perfect hedge against the dollar, because when oil went down, when the dollar went down, oil went up. So I'm buying oil now, and when I need dollars, I've hedged against inflation. Yep. Now we have a high dollar and high oil prices. That's qualitatively very, very difficult. It's very difficult for OPEC, because the declaration of cooperation is important. The declaration of cooperation is where those 10 countries led by Russia came into an agreement with the Organization of Oil Exporting Countries to work together. And that was that was more than a decade of making, and that's, I think, for OPEC current viewing. You never can say, when you have these big geopolitical shifts, you never can say, oh, it is. You can say current thinking is that that's something that they see going on for decades, whereas this war may not go on for. We hope does not go on for decades. So that cooperation is still there. But as I said in the beginning, where is the spare capacity? I mean, I see that month after month, OPEC is releasing 400,000 barrels a day. And that in January, again, I'm listening to S&P Platts. I'm not, I haven't been there counting the barrels, and the IEA and OPEC may have different views, but I'm taking a neutral body, so to speak. They only produced an incremental 160,000 barrels a day, so that makes it very, very difficult. And it also makes it very difficult because where is that incremental barrel coming from? And going forward, OPEC Plus will probably be, especially with energy transition, will be the producers of the incremental barrels, because it is those state-run, there's incredibly well state-run companies, the Saudi Aramcos, the ADNOCs of this world, who will also get the funding from their governments to invest. And let's not not say, and then again, we have to be careful. The kingdom, KSA, is not, and UAE, they're on the energy transition track, you know. They have the Saudi Green Initiative and the Middle East Green Initiative. We have Masdar. We have all of these great initiatives, great organizations. It's just the incremental barrel that may not be used there, but may have to go to Africa, will probably be produced by them, because it's also state-run money that they can direct with more ease, and they may have more tolerance for risk than your pension fund.
Yeah. Sensibly so. Dear Cornelia, our food for thought draws to a close. Ladies and gentlemen, we think we all have a virtual big round of applause for Cornelia for that splendid insights she given us. And ladies and gentlemen, please tune in again when on March 22nd at 9 o'clock CET, we will have Irene Hemstreck, the head of ECB Climate Change Center. And we will continue that very lively discussion, I hope. Thank you very much.
Thank you.